was later in the 1970s when we were living in New Haven, Connecticut, that I went to spend a day with a deaconess in New York City. She introduced me throughout the day as a former deaconess, but by the end of the day she said, "No, Norma, you are a deaconess." And it was through her words, that began my renewal of my own identity as a deaconess. Until then, the Lutheran Deaconess Association board had, of course, been all men. But now there were a few women on the board. So the board made a decision, a simple resolution, that all women who had been consecrated would be deaconesses. Simple words, but comprehensive changes in women's lives. At about the same time, I was auditing a course at Yale Divinity School taught by Letty Russell in preparation for my entering as a student the next year. And so even as an auditor, I decided to do a research paper and research these women, find out where they were and who they were, to whom this letter had been said that you are now a deaconess. Finding some of them was even difficult because, of course, their names had changed. One of the negative legacies of women, they lose their identity. But I did send a letter to quite a few of them, and I had interesting responses. Some had continued contact, as had I, but others wrote back and said, "I don't know what those words mean." Now, the words were not hard to understand, but they had internalized the negation and had gone on to find other roles in their own lives. It would take us, well, until this day, over 30 years later, for us to continue to regather these women who had been put out of their role of public ministry. My own renewal came as well. I bought a navy blue dress and again took out the Deaconess Cross. Our Northeast area conference met frequently. We met in New York City or in New Haven or in Bridgeport, or sometimes went up to meet with Karna in New Hampshire, and it was a wonderful support group. I was elected to the LDA Board of Directors, traveling back and forth to Indiana. In fact, I subsequently became president, the first woman to be president of our own deaconess community. By the mid-1970s, things were changing in the church as well. The American Lutheran Church and the Lutheran Church in America were now ordaining women. I had not even heard of that. And I was now a student at Yale Divinity School. That's another storyline. It was one time when our Northeast area conference of deaconesses was meeting, actually in Bridgeport, Connecticut. It was a hot summer day in August, so we decided to kind of meet inside the garage in a shaded area. And it was at that meeting that I asked permission of my deaconess sisters to seek ordination. Now that may seem strange because it wasn't an order in which we needed to ask permission of the Mother Superior, but I decided to submit myself to their will for me because I knew their will for me would be good for me and also a way to follow the will of my service to God in the church and in the world. And they said, well, if we have women who are now being ordained, at least some of them ought to come from the whole line of deaconesses that have been there since the New Testament church. And so indeed, they supported me and encouraged me to seek ordination. I sought ordination and was ordained in 1977 at a service at Yale Divinity School Chapel, 17 years after entering public ministry. It may have been the first time globally that a deaconess was ordained as a pastor. Now, no one quite knew how to do this, and people began to say to me, now that you're going up to higher things, well, that didn't sound right to me, so I decided, why stop being a deaconess? Actually, the ministry of Word and Sacrament should be an expression of servanthood ministry. And so at the ordination itself, it was the custom in Missouri Synod at that time to have pastors come and lay on hands individually. So we had pastors lay on hands and deaconesses lay on hands alternately. When you're changing history, you have to just make it up a little bit. After ordination, I was on the clergy roster of the American Lutheran Church and remained on the deaconess list in the yearbook of the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod. That went on for a couple of years until they found out and Missouri took me out of their book. My Northeast Iowa Conference had encouraged and supported me And they and many other deaconesses rejoiced because now at our annual deaconess conference, we wouldn't have to call in a man to consecrate the elements at communion. We could have one of our own sisters who would be able to celebrate the Eucharist. Change had come, but change does not come uniformly. While many were excited, there hadn't been the time for many of the deaconesses to really digest what it would mean for one of their sisters to be ordained. So as we went to Valparaiso the next summer, I having been invited to celebrate Eucharist, some women all of a sudden realized what this might mean and started to object. So the leaders of our deaconess conference met late into the night, and it would be Evelyn, a dear sister who comforted many of us through the years, who would be the one to bring me the news. They have disinvited you, Norma. You're being replaced with a man. After all these years of waiting, that somehow women's community still would have to have a man celebrating Eucharist. It was hard, not only for me. There was anger also among many of the other deaconesses who had supported my ordination. But I decided that at the Eucharist that next morning I would attend. Certainly there would have been the occasion to split the diaconate if I had gotten up to leave. I'm sure a lot of others would have left with me, but we stayed. Jamie drove me back to New Haven. I remember I couldn't eat for 3 days. I told the deaconess community that I would not leave the community, but that I for a while would need to spend my energy other places. I was at that time teaching at Yale and would then soon teach at Wartburg. And I did. But after a few years of the women of the community studying this issue and what it would mean for them, they then again invited me to celebrate. Of the dozen or so women in our community of 400 who have been ordained, we celebrate to this day. But as we meet, we take turns so that women of the ELCA who are ordained celebrate at some, and then Lutheran Church Missouri Synod men celebrate at some. You see, it was during the early 1970s that the Missouri Synod broke apart, a modern-day church schism. That was before I was ordained, when I was chair of the board of the Lutheran Deaconess Association. I remember coming back to a conference after that fateful meeting in New Orleans and saying, well, we're heretics too. They'll get to us soon enough. But not right away. Women are always last, even being named as heretics. But the Deaconess Association, because it was an independent corporation in the state of Indiana, could not be dissolved or taken over. But the Missouri Synod did another thing. They just pretended we didn't exist and started a deaconess training program of their own. But our community decided not to be divided over men's wars. It's kind of like saying a hospital on the border of two countries at war. Maybe the lines change, but the hospital knows its service is needed. And so our deaconess community remains to this day, about half of us serving in the ELCA and half in Missouri Synod in all kinds of ministries.